Okay. So I won't read the title here. The image here is of something that are called seques, which I'll talk about a little bit further on in this discussion. Okay, it's not okay. There we should. All right. So I wanted to begin by saying I'm not a historian or an archaeologist of the Andes. My fieldwork has been in lowland South America among Guarani-speaking indigenous people, and actually they have an interesting relationship to the Inca Empire in that they really view the Inca Empire as a foil for their own historical self-fashioning. So this first image, it was a statue that was put up in the lowland city of Santa Cruz de la Sierra in the sort of the early to mid 1970s, basically by white Bolivians in that area who were kind of adopting the history of lowland indigenous people as their own history. And they had this kind of semi-mythical history that the Guarani people had stopped the Inca Empire from encroaching on lowland territories. So this is like a fierce, they call it, the old-fashioned term is chirihuano. And interestingly, even though this was sort of a white historical myth about inter-indigenous relations in, before the arrival of colonial authorities, as Guarani indigenous people have become more politically active in Bolivia, they have kind of adopted this myth as their own. And they're like, we're the warriors who kept the Inca from descending from the Andes. And this has a lot to do with regional tensions in Bolivia. So anyway, this is what I actually specialize in. But I've been teaching courses on Indigenous South America for many years now. And I have found the material on the Inca particularly rich for thinking about Indigenous ways of knowing, which is certainly something some of you may be aware that in Canada, we're going through a process of Indigenous reconciliation. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm not going to remember the date off the top of my head, but definitely within the past decade. And Canada has been really grappling with its treatment of Indigenous peoples and what that's looked like in the past and what it should look like going forward. And so there's been a lot of talk about indigenization of the university. And while I'm sympathetic to it, there are some things about it that I think could bear a little bit of additional scrutiny. And so I want to use the case of the Inca to think about that. So one of the things that one sees a lot in this rhetoric around indigenization, and I feel like this is probably true also in the United States, although I'm much more familiar with the Canadian context, is there sometimes seems to be less interest in the rich variability of cultural difference and a lot of sort of expressions of kind of simple inversions. And I think this is a big problem I wouldn't say this is limited to the recent discourse on indigenization. I think this is something that the discipline of anthropology has had a problem with for a long time. It's something I've written about. It's something Eduardo Riberos de Castro has written about. I mean, this is not an entirely new observation. But you'll see, and this is something that I just pulled off the internet as sort of emblematic of this approach. So you see, it's sort of like, well, the West is X and indigeneity is kind of not X. These accounts that I think are quite simplistic. Let me pause for a second, whoops, and just see, is the sound okay? Is the audio pretty good?
It sounds fine to me.
Okay, all right, I'm gonna assume the audio is good then. I just wanted to check early on. Okay. So applied to the case of the Inca, I think these kinds of simple inversions miss everything that is truly interesting about this case. And I think one could do this kind of account for many other indigenous cultures of the Americas, but there's a really rich documentation about the Inca, so that's why the Inca is a really nice case for thinking about this. So the Inca trajectory, of course, was dramatically different from any Western historical trajectory. At the same time, the Inca Empire was a serious empire. It didn't kid around about hierarchy. It didn't kid around about compartmentalization. And it was also sort of fascinatingly obsessive about bureaucratic record keeping in ways that I think are just incredibly poorly captured by these kinds of models. Okay. So some of you in the audience may actually know more about the Inca Empire than I do. I don't know what everybody is a specialist in or studies, but some of you may not know anything about the Inca Empire. So let me just give you like a quick, like one slide about the Inca Empire. So for the first thing to know about the Inca Empire is it certainly was not the first major empire to rise in South America. It was kind of, there had been a bunch before it, but it was the one that happened to be in full expansion at the time that the Spanish arrived to South America in 1532. And there, it had actually expanded very rapidly in less than 100 years. So here's Cusco, the kind of capital city of, why does it do that? Of the Inca Empire. And what had happened is the Inca Empire had expanded along the spine of the Andes, north and south. So they quickly expanded through the Andes. The coast here is really narrow up against the Andes. But in fact, one of the interesting things about the Inca Empire is they were not very interested in lowland South America. They seemed to find Amazonian, just the climate, everything about it, inhospitable. They were not very interested in eastward expansion. So that thing that I was saying about Guarani people saying like, we stopped the Inca from expanding. I mean, in fact, the Inca Empire was not very interested in expanding down the eastern side of the Andean foothills and into the South American tropics. Okay, so as some of you may already be aware, there was actually a bitter war of kind of dynastic succession between two brothers. They were the sons of Huayna Capac, who had died in 1525, and Huáscar and Atahualpa were like having a dynastic war of succession when the Spanish, when Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532. And of course, this is part of the dynamic that causes the Inca Empire to collapse so quickly. I'll be showing a bunch of images in today's talk from this amazing letter written by a guy named Felipe Huamampoma de Ayala. I don't believe that anyone actually knows his birth and death dates, but he wrote a letter to the Spanish king towards the end of his life. So he wrote the letter in 1615. He talks about being elderly. The Spanish king at that time, I think, was Philip IV. Felipe Huamampoma de Ayala was a first-generation descendant of the conquest. So his father was the Spaniard. His mother was an aristocratic Inca woman. You can see in his name, Huamampoma means falcon puma. So he has a name that's part Quechua, part Spanish. And he had loyalties to both sides. He really took the Spanish king, he took him seriously as like, you're our king. But the point of this letter was, he was saying, you're our king, but I don't think you understand this new territory that you're ruling very well. So I'm writing you this letter that's full of drawings that first is going to describe a lot of things you probably don't know about this territory. And then he has a lot of complaints about abuses on the part of Spanish colonial authorities. And he's writing to the king like, I'm recognizing you as the authority. I'm sure if you knew about these things, you would put a stop to them. And here's my big letter describing, so you'll understand this world better and you'll stop these colonial abuses. So Felipe Huamampoma de Ayala did not experience the uncontacted Inca Empire. He's in the first generation. He was born after the Inca Empire has ended. But he's very well connected, right? So this letter is written part in Spanish and part in Quechua. He understands the Inca world very well. And this document is so tremendously valuable because it gives us what we so rarely get, which is, his dad is Spanish. So he's not just Indigenous, but his mom is Indigenous. So it gets us something very close to an Indigenous perspective, very close to the time of encounter, the kind of generation of first encounter. And what I'll be talking about, the images I'll be showing are several of the images from this document show quipus, and I'll explain what those are in a few minutes, and quipu camayocs. Quipu camayocs are keepers of quipus. So let me just show you some of these images. This one says contador y tesorero. So this is an Inca bureaucrat, basically holding a quipu. I don't know, and I don't know if anyone knows what this sort of counting board is for. It would be fascinating to know. But anyway, this says, this is an image of a principal, accountant, and treasurer in the Inca Empire. So one of the things he describes is the functioning, is he talks a lot about the Inca Empire is now over, but he's explaining like, this is how it worked. These are some features of the Inca Empire. Here's another image from another page of the letter. Secretario del Inca, so secretary and advisor to the Inca. And here's another high Inca imperial authority, and he's holding one of these quipus. Here's an image from the letter that says Deposito del Inca, the storehouse of the Inca. So you can see here's a warehouse, here's the Inca visiting the warehouse, and here's the kind of warehouse accountant or official who's reporting about the stores in the warehouse, and he's using a quipu to do that. Now here's one that says provincial administrator. And here, it's one of the things that's interesting about this image is he has the quipu, he has a rolled quipu and an unrolled quipu in his hands. And just notice the cone shape of the rolled quipu, because I will talk about that again in a few minutes. All right. So here are rolled and unrolled quipus in a museum collection. So here's a rolled quipu. And just notice there's that cone shape, and then there's these threads hanging down, or these kind of ropes or yarns hanging down. And here's an unrolled quipu. So a quipu is a record-keeping system made of strings and knots. So they could be rolled up and stored, or they could be unrolled and read. And the way that quipu Kameyuks read them was by feeling along, this would be the top cord, and then they would feel along the top cord, and then they would feel down those cords hanging down, and they would feel the knots, and that would give them information in a way I'll explain in a moment. Okay, if some of you are interested in this and you would like to learn more, a terrific book is The Code of the Quipu. It's published in 1981 by Marcia and Robert Asher. There have been quite a lot of discoveries about the quipu since the writing of this book, but I would say as a really fascinating overview, I would highly recommend, if you'd like to learn more, take a look at this book. Okay, so how have quipus been deciphered over the years? So Spanish chroniclers knew, some of the first Spanish observers, they knew that quipus were some sort of form of record keeping. For a number of reasons, they didn't learn how to use or understand them. So a major reason was probably just the scale of destruction from disease, from violence, from everything that happened after the arrival of the Spanish. So probably a lot of knowledge was lost immediately. But something else, another reason would probably be that they could see that what quipu Kameyuks were doing with quipus was something like reading or bookkeeping, but so unfamiliar. So it's not a graphic, right? They're not drawing pictures, they're not writing. So it's such a different form of writing or record keeping that I think it was just too puzzling for Spanish to think like, oh, this is something that I could learn, or I should sit down and try to learn. It's also the case that quipus reminded the Spanish of rosaries, because it was something like you feel along, you know, the rosaries that you use in prayers, and you feel the rosary beads, and this feeling along something and feeling the knots struck them as it's like something Christian, but it's not Christian, so it must be idolatrous. So there was also, unfortunately, a lot of active destruction of quipus. So we really didn't know. For a long time, we didn't understand quipus very well. But in 1912, an anthropologist named Leland Locke published a paper establishing that quipus had a decimal organization. So even this level of knowledge had been lost about quipus after the destruction of the Inca Empire. So, and he had actually just studied a lot of quipus in museum collections to figure this out. He didn't, as far as I know, rely on Waman Poma's letter. Waman Poma's letter, which was sent to Philip IV in circa 1615, and then Wamampoma dies, he never gets a reply. It doesn't seem to have any effect, because as far as we know, whenever I tell the story of Wamampoma's letter, I always think of the last scene in Indiana Jones, where like they have the Ark of the Covenant, and then it just gets pushed into a giant storage warehouse in Washington, D.C. Apparently Wamampoma's letter just went into the archives, and then in 1908, some scholar found it and kind of realized, oh, this is an amazing document. Okay, so Kipu means not in Quechua. And what Leland Block figured out by looking, I mean, a guy must have been a genius, really, to look at Kipu after Kipu and to notice this consistent pattern. He figured out that the organization of Kipus was decimal. So knots are of different shapes that appear along the strings of a Kipu, and a long knot marks the ones place. So long knots mean that's the end of the number, basically. That's the end of the decimal number, and then the next place up would be the tens place, the next place up would be the hundreds place. So this one short knot, two short knots, three long knots, that's the number 123. Same here. And the way Leland Locke figured this out was the Kipu image that I showed you laid out here. This is how pictures are often taken of Kipus, because they look really pretty that way. But there's actually cords that are supposed to hang down and cords that are supposed to, like, Kipu Kamayok would hold them the way you saw in those pictures. They would hold them out straight. And there's some strings that go to the top, and then there's some strings that go to the bottom. And there's a correspondence where, look, here are these three chords, 123 plus 112 plus 20, sums to 255. And this one, 322 plus 111, sums to 433. And Leland Locke looked at Kipu after Kipu after Kipu, saw this consistent pattern, and realized what it was telling him, that Kipus are a decimal recording system. And this long knot in the ones position means that this is where this number stops. And on a particularly long chord, you could have another number start. Okay, what's been studied in the years since Leland Locke deciphered Kipus is there are multiple ways that Kipus encode information. So Kipus are made of yarn. One of the ways is some kinds of information is encoded in the feel of the yarn. So the main cord is thick, that lets you know it's the main cord. These cords, their thickness tells you where they are in the hierarchy, right? This is the most important one, the thinner one is the next most important, the very thin one is kind of subsidiary, it's giving you subsidiary pieces of information. If these are numbers, you count from the skinniest back towards the fattest ones. Kipus have directionality, so they can be assigned horizontal direction. You start, the one end has a loop and the other end has a knot. They can be assigned vertical direction. They have levels. They have intervals, which may have been significant. How big is the interval between this knot and that knot? That for a Kipu Kamayok might have contained information. Finally, they have color and patterns. So I'm just giving, this would be an example. This is a total guess, right? But let's say you're the Kipu Kamayok, and this Kipu, it's a brown Kipu. That always means how many llamas are in this community, right? So brown Kipus mean llamas. Brown twisted with white means something like freeze-dried potatoes. How many freeze-dried potatoes have we got in the storehouse? We don't know, but you can imagine all the ways one could encode information using these variables. So it's a writing system that comes from a very different logical starting point. But there's all kinds of ways you can encode information. And actually, one of the things, I used to assign this to students, but well, I won't go into the details, but one of the things the Ashers do in their book is they have an assignment where you are supposed to create a Kipu that tells people the opening and closing hours of a business. So you're supposed to code for like Monday through Friday. Monday it opens at 10, closes at 4. Tuesday it opens at 9, closes at 3. And it was actually really interesting to see students they would draw their Kipu. And with this assignment, there was one way most students would do it. And then occasionally like some other student would come up with something that would work, but would be totally different. And it was an interesting lesson, not just in like cultural logics, but also the ways that different individual minds work. Okay, so quipus encode information in multiple ways. We've also learned since the time of Leland Locke that quipus were probably rewritable documents. They were living documents. And the reason we know this is Frank Solomon wrote a book in 2004 called The Cord Keepers. He came across a community, so he is an ethnographer of the Andes. He worked with a community that actually still had quipus in the community. But the quipus, people said, we no longer know how to decode quipus, but they, according to them, within, like they said, our grandparents could have. Although with those kinds of, you never know if that means their grandparents would have said our grandparents could have. But anyway, at some point, people knew how to use the quipus. And one of the things they told him is when people knew how to kind of do the quipu coding, one of the things they would do is at the beginning of the year, they would have these ceremonies at the beginning of the year. You'd bring out the quipu, you would tie the knots in it that marked certain kinds of obligations. Like it's this group of families' job to clear all the accumulated gunk from the irrigation canals. It's this family's responsibility to sponsor the music for our next festival. It's this group of families' responsibility to provide the food for a festival X during the year. So you tie the knots that mark those obligations. And at the end of the year, you bring the quipus out again. And if people have fulfilled their obligations, you untie the knots. Now, if you think about this as a record keeping device, it means that you can put a piece of information in, tying the knot, and you can take the piece of information out. So this is, you can be updating the document as you use it. We also know that from some of the observations that some of the earliest Spanish arrivals to the Inca Empire noted was they said it wasn't just numerical information that quipu kamahios could tell. They could tell histories using the quipus. We really don't know how that worked. So was it just a mnemonic device? Was it mostly oral tradition that the knots would remind you? And would the knot have a certain shape? Would it be like, oh, a knot of this shape is like a battle, a knot of this shape is an exciting romance, and like first you come in and you're like, oh yeah, then tell this battle and then tell this exciting romance? Or was it, and this is something that the Ashers talk about, there are ways you can have numerical codes be placed at the service of literacy. So could quipus have worked this way? So let me just give you an example of what that means. So the phone number in my office begins 780. If you know, that's like, oh, that's an Edmonton telephone number. The second part of the phone in my office is 492. 492, those are university phone numbers, right? So already there's a code that tells you this is a person who lives in Edmonton and works at the university. So were there codes of that kind built into quipus, and is that how they use them as in the service of literacy? It's interesting to think about. We don't really know. The most recent, as far as I know, the most recent discovery about quipus was something published in 2018. Gary Urton and Manuel Medrano published a paper in Ethnohistory that for the first time linked the colors and patterning in a set of surviving quipus to individual names and social statuses in a community for which we have a written colonial era census from 1670. So at that time, you know, it's close enough to the end of the Inca Empire. There are people who remember how to code quipus, right? How to make quipus. And in this case, these quipus were recording information about individual people. And they could correlate those things. So that was really exciting. Shows you the level of detail that could be built into quipus and some of the encoding devices used. So colors and patterns in the yarn of the quipu. Okay, so I just want to mention a couple of things about the organization of the Inca Empire. So the Inca name for their own empire in Quechua was Tawantinsuyu, which could be translated as the 4 regions. They thought of their empire as having sort of 4 subunits. And then so that's the major overarching division of the empire into 4 subunits. But then it's also organized up from the bottom. So local administrators were built out of units of 10. So the lowest administrator was responsible for 10 families. The administrator over him oversaw 10 guys who oversaw 10 families. Next guy oversees the guy who sees 10 guys and builds up. I don't know how many levels there are in between the guy who looks after 10 families and the provincial governor of a governor. And then of course above that is the Inka. But just notice this decimal division again. In some kind of respects, the empire seems to have been conceived of as a giant extended family. Citizens were categorized as to sex, and then classified into 5 classes that were partially age-based, but for example, interestingly, included a category of people with disabilities. This was important because one of the things the Inca Empire was really interested in was labor tribute. So they wanted to know how many people, particularly wanted to know how many people are in the category of like working age adults. So how much labor tribute can we oblige this community to provide? But again, this classification lends itself to decimal record keeping. Quipus, we know for sure that quipus were used to keep track of the contents of a network of storehouses that existed around the Inca Empire that were linked by the imperial road system. Some of the things these storehouses contained: food. So freeze drying, because of the climate in the Andes, it's very dry and it gets very cold at night. Freeze drying was developed in the Andes. So our word beef jerky is actually, this is the kind of thing I just tell my students. The word jerky in English actually is a Quechua word. Charqui is made from llama meat. And freeze-dried potatoes were also stored in these warehouses. So these were, if crops failed in one area, you had storehouses that could provide food. The other thing that was present in these warehouses in great volumes were textiles, which the Spanish found really puzzling. They were like, we can understand the food. And they thought it was impressive because one of the things they said is they could give, they could uniform their soldiers out of these storehouses lickety-split because they had so many textiles. But there were also just a puzzling volume of textiles, which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing that we know quipus were used for, we're keeping track of tributary obligations of human labor. So some of the kinds of labor that the Inca Empire kind of demanded and used were labor for building irrigation terraces, which are very important in the Andes. The Inca Empire essentially occupies the Altiplano, which is this high plain. It's very dry on that high plain. So the reason agriculture is possible is because it relies on snowmelt from the even higher peaks of the high Andes. So building irrigation terraces that kind of controls the flow, captures that water, is really important for Andean agriculture. You needed labor to build roads, you needed labor for your soldiers, you needed labor, particularly from women, to make these tons of textiles that the Inca Empire made in great volumes. You needed labor to work in the mines. And the Inca Empire didn't kid around about this. So one feature of Inca imperial rule were the mitmakuna. So these were communities that were subject to forced labor resettlement. And one of the reasons we know about mitmakuna communities is because well into the colonial period, people would say, oh, that village over there, they're not originally from here. That's a mitmakuna village. They were brought, and the people themselves would say, yes, like we're the descendants of people who were brought from a far off part of the empire. And this was sometimes used as a form of punishment. So the Inca Empire expands really quickly. And let's say there's a village that's a little bit uncooperative about becoming a part of the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire is like, oh, we think we'll send you to work, all of you, to work in the mines. And then you ask everybody else, like, do you guys feel cool about being a part of the Inca Empire? We feel totally cool about being like, we don't feel rebellious anymore. One of the other features of the Inca Empire were capacocha tributes. So one of the things that was kept track of in the censuses that the Inca Empire would take of communities was working age people. They also made notes about people who were particularly attractive. So sometimes these were young men and women, young women who were called aclacuna, who would be sent to Cusco to work on special, like fine textile production, and they would spend their lives working in what the Spanish described as convents. I mean, obviously they weren't convents, but they were they were sent to make special fine textiles that you only made in the Imperial Center. There was also yanakonas, who were like attractive young men who would maybe do imperial soldiering or work as servants in elite households back in Cusco. But also some very beautiful children were chosen for sacrifice. The conditions of the sacrifice, as far as we can tell, seem to have been fairly humane. The children were brought to Cusco. Boys and girls were kind of ceremonially married, and then they were redistributed out to particularly powerful sites around the empire, where they would be fed really well, and they would drink a lot of corn beer and become drunk, and then be left and die of exposure, which, as deaths go, you fall asleep. It's not so painful. So maybe it wasn't that horrible an experience for the child, but you can imagine for the families, this would be a very effective form of imperial terror, right? Like, we're the Inca Empire, we have the right to take your most beautiful child, and we will. Okay, so this is to say the Inca Empire is tremendously impressive, but it's not relaxed and groovy. The warehouses, the textiles that they were full of, there are some suggestive hints that these were, in a sense, sort of functioned like banks. You can imagine if aliens landed on Earth and they went and looked at our banks and they were like, why are you holding these bundles of pieces of cloth behind like a heavy padlocked door? Like, who the hell cares? It's just patterned cloth, which would be like dollar bills. Where certain kinds of textiles seem to circulate in order to like pay for kinds of duties, in order to be given to high officials. It seemed to work in certain senses a little bit like cash. And so when the Spanish looked at it, they were like, what is this deal with cloth? They were just interested in gold and silver, but I think that it may have worked as a kind of banking system in the Inca Empire. Okay, Coricancha was the Temple of the Sun, which was in the center of Cusco. If you ever visit Cusco, some of the walls of Coricancha still exist. As the Spanish often did, they built a cathedral right on top of the major temple in Cusco. Apparently, it was an incredibly impressive sight to see for the first Spanish who got to see it. So next to Coricancha was this giant plaza. Its walls were covered with thin sheets of hammered gold, and the plaza itself was full of combed white sand. So when the high Andean, very bright sunshine hit it during the day, it shone like the sun. So this is like, Cusco is like the center of the universe. Here's a schematic map of Cusco, the location of Coricancha, and then going out from Coricancha are these things called seques, which had an important ritual role in the Inca Empire. So one of the things that the Inca emperor did was he would travel along these seque lines that had, in concert with certain features of the annual round. So certain kinds of agricultural festivals would happen at sites along the seque lines. And he would visit huacas. Huacas were stone. Juan Poma describes them as ídolos, as idols, but they were ritually important things that were sort of nodes of power. Now, just to think again about, there's these lines going out from Cusco, and there are these nodes of power along it. We see this kind of repeated theme of the line and the stopping point, the line and the stopping point. And the Inca would go and visit the huacas, and sometimes he would bring the huacas to Cusco and like kind of consult with the huacas in Cusco. So there, again and again, there's this theme of things that circulate and are stopped, and it can be the power of the Inca Empire that goes out along the seque line, stops at huacas. It can be the water, the agricultural water that stopped on the agricultural terraces. It can be the textiles that women are brought into Cusco to make the textiles, and then textiles go out and they stop at the warehouses along the way. Food stops at the warehouses, certain kinds of vital energy. One of the explanations for the Capacocha children is these beautiful children are full of the vitality of life, and they would kind of be sacrificed in order to renew the power of huacas. And the Inca is the person who can make the flows happen, and he can also stop the flows. So, and this doesn't stop with his death. dead Incas were mummified and their bodies were brought out on certain occasions. Okay, so this idea of power that flows and is bound, is connected to, in some certain obvious ways, in terms of Inca imperial control, it's connected to the power of irrigation in the Inca Empire. So water that flows and is stopped along agricultural terraces is foundational to the whole base of the Inca Empire. But binding and releasing water was another way of enforcing imperial discipline. So here, the water flows down from the high Andean, from the snowmelt from the high Andean mountains. These are the extensive agricultural terracing in the Andes is very impressive. It's one of the things the empire organized labor teams to make and maintain. But it's also a way that the Inca Empire enforced its control, because if some community was a bit cheeky, the Inca Empire could cut off, they could say, yeah, you know what, I think we're gonna stop the flow of water to these terraces and just wait about 6 months. Oh, are you guys feeling a little less rebellious? Oh, I thought so. Is everybody around feeling a little less rebellious? Can they see we can cut off your supply of water and you can starve to death? Oh, you're feeling more cooperative. Great. Okay, so I just want to, if you were to use a Freudian phrase, you could say the use of knots and strings is kind of overdetermined for the Inca Empire. This flow and stop, flow and stop, flow and stop. I'm sorry, I'm seeing that it's almost 6:15, so I'm just going to move a little faster. There is over and over again this pattern that even the coiled quipu that's pointy and has these strings flowing down, it looks like a mountain, kind of. So there's a thematic resonance. It certainly connects to the land and the way of life. It connects to the fact of being an Andean community that is dependent on the flow of snowmelt down the mountainside, that you have to stop and it flows and you stop and you flow it. And then the Inca is the person who's like particularly controls flows and stops. And the record keeping is based on this flowing and stopping kind of imagery and technique. But this certainly, it's connected to, it's like connected to the land, connected to the way of life, but not in a way that lends itself to cuddly sentimentality, if you really know a lot about how the Inca Empire was run. The symbolism of the knot, you can imagine if you're a community that has been incorporated into the Inca Empire, that knot is like, here's what you owe us. We're gonna get you. If we come at the end of the year and you can't untie that knot, you're gonna be shipped off to another part of the empire, or we're going to cut off the supply of water to you. So the ideology of the Inca Empire was, once they took over your community, they let you know that, in fact, the Inca is the son of the sun. He owned all this land already anyway, and very kindly, he's going to allow you to live on it, but you're going to owe him some tribute in return. There was a very hierarchical ranking system, a very organized ranking system that collected this tribute, and the Inca kept track of it on their quipus, you know, down to the last piece of dried llama meat. There is, you could say there's kind of a fiber logic to their writing system, this idea of weaving, knotting, tying up things, letting them flow again, storing, drying, freezing some kinds of food, then allowing it to liquefy again when you pass it out to the people and they eat it. There's these rituals that have to do with the circulation of vital powers. So it's recognizable and yet genuinely different. There's no way you could say the logic of the Inca Empire is like the opposite of the logic of the West, right? It's at an oblique angle to anything Western. And if you start to look for it, there are these themes that run through their technology. So the Inca are known for, and Andeans are known for technologies of tensile strength. So not compressive strength, but for example, the building of these rope bridges that they made across deep gorges, because the Andean landscape goes like this, and it would take you forever to go down and then up again. But if you can cross on a fibrous bridge, this bridge holds together through tensile strength, not compressive strength. It's that twist, that woven strength. The Inca are famous for their woven stone masonry, which fits together perfectly without mortar. And it was, the Spanish noticed right away, because they built one of the first cathedrals they built on top of Coricancha. Cusco had a major earthquake in 1650. The Spanish built cathedral fell down totally. The woven stone Inca masonry stuck together, and it seems that it's very strong, but it has some kind of capacity to wriggle with earthquakes. It survived really well. This Andean, the Andes are kind of prone to earthquakes. Inca metallurgy. This last point is borrowed from Charles Mann's book. Archaeologists have wondered why Andean people didn't have a Bronze Age. Why didn't they make hard metal weapons? They had plenty of raw material, they knew how to smelt, but they seemed to maximize other properties in metal: flexibility, shininess, reflective brilliance. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of examples of this kind of metal work because the Spanish colonial authorities were eager to find all the gold and silver and melt it down. So this is my concluding slide, which is, I think Indigenous ways of knowing are, of course, real. There are different logic, there's different cosmologies, there's different logical ways to think through how to accomplish things, how the world works, what makes sense to use as a technology, as a record-keeping device. So I am not a critic of Indigenous ways of knowing as a frame for thinking about other cultures. I do find some of the accounts of indigenization, which seem really to be framed in terms of, if the West is X, Indigenous is not X, they're incorrect, and they're so boring. Because if you really look at a case like the Inca Empire, what's fascinating about it is how, on the one hand, it's totally mean, like every empire, right? They're gonna crack you on the head if you don't obey. They're gonna keep careful record of what they say you owe them. They're gonna have an ideology that says, oh, now that we've taken you over, guess what? You owe us, and we're gonna come crack you on the head and terrorize you and steal your kids if you don't do it. At the same time, it's not the same as saying, well, they're just a bunch of jerks like every empire, although they kind of were just a bunch of jerks like every empire. They also have this, so that's the same. And then they have this fascinating whole different logic that you would never be able to imagine it. It certainly wouldn't be captured by thinking like, oh, it's just the opposite of whatever the West does. And it's taken us so long. It's so sad that I think, the Spanish found the Andean form of writing so unfamiliar as a form of writing. They didn't even think to try and learn how to decipher it. It's taken us, we've had to kind of work backwards to try and figure some of this stuff out. So anyway, if again, just as a final thing about the Asher's book ends with a discussion of topology and mathematics, and how the Quipu are an interesting example of mathematical topology. So again, if that's something that fascinates you, I would say have a look at it. Yeah, but we have a little bit of time. Sorry for talking so much, but I'm interested to get any questions. And thank you again, Elizabeth, for kind of creating a space for thinking and talking differently about Indigenous issues and anthropology. I'm so grateful to have been able to do this.
Thank you so much for taking the time. That was fascinating. I don't have any questions from anybody else yet, but feel free if you do, if you are shy and you want to type it in into the chat, I'm happy to take questions from that way. I'm also happy to take questions if somebody wants to unmute themselves and show themselves, or at least unmute themselves and ask a question that way as well. I'm fine with that. I do have a couple comments. One of the things is, I know, I teach a mummies class, and one of the interesting things I find about ancient Egypt is that the hieroglyphics were incredibly hard to read, and then they changed once the Romans enter into ancient Egypt and they get the Greco-Roman alphabet, that spreads literacy throughout the Egyptian region. Do you know who knew how to read those quipus? Because it seems like it would be a skill that maybe not everybody in the empire would know, and a way to control others by having this kind of complex system.
Oh, that's an interesting thought, because it definitely seems clear that I think, from what I've read, it sounds like only Quipu Kamayoks knew how to read quipus. And we don't even know, did each Quipu Kamayok develop their own, were they like, listen, we just need you to count the llamas, knock yourself out, like whatever if brown yarn means llamas in your system, that's great. And as opposed to, was there an Inca Empire wide thing that said brown yarn always means llamas, so that one Quipu Kamayok could read another Quipu Kamayok's quipus? We actually don't know. It would be interesting to know, but I think you're right. It definitely served as, this was sort of an elite closed system of knowledge that only specialists really knew how to decipher quipus.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? No?
I was also going to say, it's interesting that you mentioned the Egyptians, because there's some interesting parallels between the Egyptian and the Inca empires, in that they're both relied on irrigation, and certain things about the structure of the pharaoh, the only guy great enough to be the official wife of the pharaoh was the pharaoh's sister. He had other wives, and that was also true in the Inca Empire, that your main wife was your sister, because nobody else was cool enough to marry you. Of course, you had other consorts, but the only person who was sort of elite enough to be the wife of the Inca would be his sister. So it's interesting that these things, things recur in cultures and don't recur in cultures, which is so, so cool.
And the funny thing is that some things that recur don't seem to make sense biologically or evolutionarily. And so you think, this is, some universal things are definitely, related to biology or evolution, but others are like, we see this over and over again. It doesn't make sense.
Right. And I think it marks, like, you're allowed to do this thing that no one else is allowed to do. So it wouldn't make any biological difference to the population. But one of the things that marks you as super special is this thing that would be forbidden to everyone else, is you're allowed, where everyone else is like, no way, Jose.
That's interesting. Another thing is that what I found fascinating is the fact that it was based on the decimal, and this concept of based on 10. I mean, we have that in the metric system, and we have that in a lot of other systems. But then for some reason, the British Empire goes all kind of crazy and gives us the imperial system that's based on all sorts of numbers. Are there any other examples that you can think of that are away from the decimal, like the British system?
I think that, wasn't the Maya, somebody had like a base 6 system or something that would be like it seems really awkward to work with. Don't quote me on that. I wish I could remember the title. There's a fascinating book about like mathematical systems in different cultures. And I'm pretty sure somebody has a base 6 system, which you'd think would not be an easy one to work with, but yeah. So even weirder than the British system. Even more awkward.
Is that possible? And my final point, and if somebody else has something, please speak up, is about the mummified kids, mummified children. One of the interesting things that we go through all the different ones that have been discovered in our mummies class, and that even though it seems that a lot of them have, there's a great deal of variation on how they were treated at the site at the time of death. So some of them, it does seem that they were just left to the elements, but others were like hit on the orbit or bound so tightly. And I think that this speaks to the fact that some children, teenagers, were more compliant or less fighting it than others. And if I recall correctly, if you look at the pattern, it's actually the females who were more often in the child sacrifices were more often the victims of a violent death than the males. You have any thoughts on that?
That's interesting. I didn't know that. So I guess I'm wrong. I thought it was supposed to be like, generally speaking, it's not very merciful to sacrifice children, but that generally the conditions of the sacrifice. So I didn't know that there were some, oh, that's a bit depressing. No, I don't know anything. No, sorry, I don't know anything about that. That's interesting though.
Jesus, do you have a question? I see you've hidden yourself.
No, I don't have a current question at the moment.
Anybody
Sorry.
else? No, that's okay. Well, it's coming upon 5:30. It's 6:30 your time. I want to thank you so much for this. This is fascinating, and it was information that I had not learned of before, and I look forward to introducing some of these concepts into my class, especially next semester when I teach mummies. And I thank you again for your time.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to everyone who came. It was really a pleasure. It was really a delight. So thanks so much. All right. So Elizabeth, should I just sign off, or did you want to talk to me afterwards? Or
yeah, just hold on a second afterwards, right?
Okay. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
I'm gonna stop recording now.